be? Do you want to be a Band-Aid? Should we be a patch to this, or do we want to be part of the cure? And this is, I think, a huge opportunity for enterprise architecture, because this space, that's surrounding organizations is big, and it's getting bigger, and it's not really owned by anyone. There are pieces that are being owned. So the cybersecurity piece, we have a lot going on information security in that area, but just this idea of total enterprise security is still kind of open. The threat vulnerability landscape is getting bigger. One of the reasons is this Internet of Things, IoT, whereas my friends in cybersecurity call it Internet of Threats. And as we put more devices and increase the spaces of intelligent things, whether it's the smartwatch, the car, the heating system in a house, every one of these opens up a vulnerability. I was just reading an article this week about people that put home security systems in or baby monitors in. They're extremely vulnerable to compromise. This was an interesting article, and it kind of summarizes how difficult this is. So this is Raytheon does really good articles. Ponemon is a really good publication that they put out in cybersecurity. But this was an article they wrote where they were trying to predict the future for cybersecurity. And they said, here's some reasons it might improve, and here's some reason it might decline. And I had to massage the language a little bit, but basically the reasons for the improvement or the decline are exactly the same. It's just a roll of the dice which way they're going to go. Are we going to have more timely actionable intelligence? Are we going to have more funding for better people and technology? Are the employee skills going to increase or decrease? So it's either going to be one or the other. And this chart at the top right shows you what some continents, how they were predicting their increase in security was going to be. And most of them were positive, more than 50%. But I just wonder how accurate that is. Is it possible in the United States it will be 60% more secure in the next 3 years? Or could it just be wishful thinking? This, as I mentioned about the U.S. Quality improvements in the 70s and on from the gas crisis, this is really what I thought was going to happen with that OPM hack, and I hope it still does. But what a lot of people don't realize, I was an engineer in this period, so I saw this affected the entire organization. Everybody had to go to training. Design engineers had to completely change. We had to design for manufacturability. We had to consolidate the parts we were using. We had to share them across product lines. We had to go back to the suppliers and their suppliers to do investigation and start to track and monitor quality control. And it was because up until this point in time, our quality control had been based on a screener, randomly picking products before they're going out the door and going, okay, this lot seems to be pretty good. They're okay. This process says those inspectors at the very end of the process is too little too late. You need to build it in. So it really changed from top to bottom, and it was painful. It was painful being in manufacturing at the time, going to those classes, being forced to change. And I actually think that's what we need to do right now for total enterprise security. And I have some ideas on why we need to change, but I can tell you it's going to be painful. It was not pleasant to go through all that. So the enterprise makes up a lot of things. It's much, much bigger than just information technology. I've talked a lot about and given a lot of examples about information security because they're readily available, but it applies to a lot of things, a lot of different areas, a lot of domains within our organizations. And they're falling, the security and the risk is falling into gaps. They're really not being addressed. And I thought, if nothing else, if the enterprise architects can start to address it within our limited scope, and demonstrate success, then maybe we can become a role model to the rest of the organization, if not become the overarching group that's responsible for all enterprise security, whatever piece that it falls into. Okay, let me just, this was the another observation I've made. If you really want to achieve security, if risk management, risk control is something that's really important, you cannot achieve that without testing. We saw that with quality. The inspectors at the end of the line wasn't enough. We had to test at every single point. So bug bounties is a great way to test systems. Why let someone hack your system and sell the exploit? Why not just pay them for it directly? I was reading an article this week about someone in India is a very successful bug bounty hunter. He makes millions of euros in this little poor town in India because this is what he dedicates himself to. And the companies that he's selling those vulnerabilities back to are benefiting as well because they're protecting themselves and making themselves more secure. Hopefully some of you have noticed that in the last 2 weeks, the Department of Defense is even pursuing bug bounties. They're inviting themselves to be attacked, following some rules, and then rewarding the attackers. This is not trivial to do this. You have to be prepared to immediately qualify the submission and close the gap and also reward the attacker. If you don't, you just created an enemy that's going to continue to do the exploits but sell them to somebody else. So this is not trivial to do this, but it's certainly something that Google, Facebook, and some other big companies have been successful with. And I'm very pleased to say from the articles the last couple of weeks, the Department of Defense is starting to do it as well. There is a security notion in enterprise architecture, and the one that I talk about the most is a SABSA security. So this was a Sherwood security. It was started, it was kind of integrated into the open group TOGAF model. Basically, it's a risk-driven approach to each one of the layers of the enterprise architecture with an overarching perspective. It's a risk-driven approach to doing enterprise architecture. So that's kind of not just looking at the functionality, but also what are the risk exposures that we're creating and what controls or treatments we should think about building in, and basically doing mini risk analysis at each one of the layers. This was I think this is from an article called SABSA in 3 minutes. I love brief overviews. It's a nice short brief article about SABSA. And whatever some of the strengths, it's a generic guiding framework. These are some of the strengths. It's customized to specific enterprise models. These are strengths. These are strengths. The constraints is best adopted enterprise-wide. And this is kind of my point this whole presentation. We are never going to win this battle if we keep isolating our focus for security to very narrow niche areas like information security. We need to be comprehensive. We need to look at it across all layers of the organization, and then be prepared to test them as well. SABSA asks a series of questions. This is just, I'll just leave this as a reference slide, a whole host of questions, who, what, where, when kind of questions for each one of the layers of the architecture. And this is just my closing slide. Security is architected, which is an attitude that needs, it's kind of like quality was, that was an attitude. You either have it or you don't. And it's not, some people have it, the whole organization. I think even the receptionist had to go to the quality training. It was that pervasive in the organization. Has to be enterprise wide or it's not going to ever be effective. And we have to realize that we're going to have failure. We're never going to be 100%, but we can try to measure it and get as close as possible. But in the meantime, don't put records on the web that we couldn't afford to have compromised or limit the exposure. So there's some reading. So here's some of my questions or anything you want to chat about. I didn't get to catch all the comments on the right, but I'm really curious what you guys want to talk about right now. Is total enterprise security a concept that has any, because this is going back to the 70s and 80s, we talked about total quality management, and it had a big influence on what people were doing. So I'm thinking the analogy would be total enterprise security. Oh, by the way, there's one big difference now than in the 70s and the 80s. In the 70s and 80s, we could copy the Japanese. Right now, there really is no place that's doing security really well. So we would have to be more or less like the Japanese were and figure it out and do it ourselves. And then we could set the precedent for other people to copy. So is total enterprise possible? What do we need to do? What's EA's role going to be in this? What should it be in this? This question 4, one of my favorite questions is, will built-in security replace bolted on? This is one of our, or the other in Europe, they use the baked-in analogy, but historically, and I unfortunately still see it today with our programming classes, we teach students to program. We really don't talk to them about security and least rights, privileges, and different concepts like that. We're just too busy trying to make them learn some code. So it's no surprise that later on when we build real systems, security is not built in. It's kind of an afterthought. We go back and try to layer on administrative rights and things. So is it possible to ever replace bolted on security with this built-in security idea? And what would need to happen? Do we have to go all the way back through education to start with that? So what do you guys want to talk about? What questions do you have? I like that Joshua's comment. Can you make this totally secure? Yes, but you'll never be able to use it again. Yep.
So I've got a question. What would you recommend as the top 3 security measures to implement in an organization?
At the organization level, it's going to be tough. So if we would pick a piece of the organization, it's going to be very simple. And actually, whatever we do with the piece, we would just replicate it. But that has to be the attitude change, I believe. And that's probably the hardest one to change. Everyone is so busy. We're all overworked. We're all stretched thin. Resources are so constrained. We're in a very competitive world. So how are we going to make time for this? In my opinion, the simplest place to start is to stop ignoring risk. Maybe we don't have to embrace it. Maybe we don't have to allocate funds to it, but can we at least please try to start making it permissible to start to gather risk information? And I'll give you an example. There was a risk professor at a university, and part of his course, he developed an Apple app to allow students to take pictures of risks around the university. And then he had it set up that he would forward them to the Office of Physical Plant. And the Office of Physical Plant came back and said, will you stop doing this, shut this down? They incurred a risk when they became aware of a vulnerability, and if they didn't respond to and treat it, then they increased their liability. That's all I can assume. But I see this as more often the case. People just don't want to know. I was talking to a university professor. I was talking to some executives, and he kind of snickered and said, why are you talking about this? We can't control all these risks. Why should we know about them? And so I think the single best place to start is to stop ignoring risk, except that knowing about it is the first step to doing anything about it. So let's start to aggregate the total body risk. That's just one place I would try to start.
There seems to be an entire, I guess, tragedy of the commons aspect to it, right? Where okay, any individual, let's say end user employee behavior by itself on an island, the risk of causing some massive impact is astronomically low, right? But in the aggregate, everybody engaging in that poor behavior, that's really where the risk arises, right?
Yeah, and that's probably a good analogy. If all of us lived on an island, things would be a lot easier. And I actually use the island scenario as an example of, is that a hazard? If we have a volcano on an island, is that a hazard? And what it forces you to think about is, what are the assets that are vulnerable? There are assets on islands that are uninhabited. There are the environment, the wildlife, the marine life. So it just goes back to that protector view. But yeah, you're right. So we've gotten away by ignoring things, and then all of a sudden something really awful happens, and then we go, oh. And I call those N+1 risks, low likelihood, high impact risks. Those are the ones that are very expensive, and I think people kind of go, well, you could never predicted it. So, but I think should Japan have been able to foresee that nuclear reactor being flooded? Should that have been a possibility, or was that truly an extremely rare event that required not building the wall 40 meters higher for whatever cost that would have incurred? So it brings up interesting questions. One of the problems, and I'm looking at Michael's comment, one of the problems I see though, let's say we can start to begin in our own little space, keeping track of risk scenarios. What are the assets? Even getting a list of assets is not that trivial. The accountants in the room will say, "Well, just go to accounting. We'll tell you what the assets are," but that's only a fraction of the assets. And the way to value the assets isn't always by purchase price. Sometimes, and this is one of the things you see with power generations, I'm told that the generators for generating electricity, it's not how much they cost, it's just that it takes a couple years for them to get produced and to be replaced. They're not a lot sitting on the shelf. So there's lots of different ways to value asset value. But I think my biggest frustration is people not wanting to list assets. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out what do you consider assets? I mean, skipping physical assets, let's look at electronic assets. What do you think are the most important assets to an enterprise?
Well, that question depends on the enterprise. So if you're Amazon, your assets are probably going to be that your web servers are up and they're able to have purchases being made. So that would be and I'm looking at that part of Amazon, not their whole back-end cloud part, but it really varies by business what the most critical assets are, or what the assets are in general. So some of them are quantified in accounting, some of them are more intangible. Some of them are critical to the operations. Availability of a website to any e-commerce company is going to be very critical. So the distributed denial of service attack is going to be something that's going to be a very serious threat to them. The one attack right now, that slide I showed you much earlier with the European assessment of threats, threat landscape changing. I looked through there. I don't see CryptoLocker listed at all. And that was only 2 or 3 years ago that list was made. So CryptoLocker, should a hospital be compromised by a CryptoLock attack? You know, so where someone comes in and encrypts your database and charges you a ransom. Why is a hospital able to be blackmailed? You wouldn't think of the database in a hospital being a very critical asset, but if you look at hospitals, that's keeping track of medicines, it's keeping track of medical records, diagnoses, billing, even the food that special dietary needs have to be distributed. And I know some of this because our hospital lost power for a couple of days and their information systems went down, and it was just a horror story. But what were those IT people doing to secure those assets? Were they doing real-time mirroring of those drives? Well, they get encrypted too. To my knowledge, the only way to protect yourself against a crypto attack is to have tapes. And those are going to be dated. So you're willing to accept a day's loss of data or something. But that's why the CryptoLocker thing is so lucrative right now and becoming more popular. People are paying the money. Yeah, I like the comment about the 20 doors, 19 are locked. I used a door locked illustration. State College is a fairly peaceful area, so students have a little bit of an issue with what's the difference between a threat and a vulnerability, and why do we need to worry about threat vulnerability pairs? If we forget to lock the doors in the IT building in our classrooms, that's a vulnerability, but we don't have too many threats coming through rattling doors to see if they can get inside. So it's something that not a big issue where we are, but in some communities, not locking the doors, you're going to have someone probing the door. So there is going to be a threat. And that's when you have to worry the most, is when the threat and vulnerability aligns. There's a little cartoon sketch, and some of you may have seen it, this I Love Lucy clip, where one of the episodes, she's trying to pack candy coming off of a conveyor belt. And the humor is the candy starts in the beginning, she can put it in the boxes, no problem, but all of a sudden the conveyor belt goes faster and she's just trying to put the candy anywhere. She's sticking it in her pockets, stuffing it down her blouse, everywhere. That's the analogy I have where we are right now, at least with cybersecurity. The stuff is coming at us so fast from so many different directions that I would not with confidence say we're winning this battle. I would not with confidence say, as that one chart said, in 3 years, we're going to be 60% more secure. I think we have to stop the slippage before we can ever start talking about improvement. So, and that's a horrible pessimistic view of things. But I have confidence. I have confidence that people like you, the enterprise architects, the people that understand technology and understand business strategy, will have an influence and be able to say, we have to stop this traditional approach. We have to do something different. The same approach is going to get us the same results. Yeah, the North Corp distributed denial of service attacks. We actually put that up on one of the TV monitors in the IST building because it's very graphic and very beautiful. They also were one of the key sponsors at the RSA conference. They had their name on every one of the ID tags. And so that's another good thing for Norse. So Rosalie, next steps?
Yes.
What would you like to talk about now?
I don't know. I already talked about the weather. You guys, Vishal, I muted you a couple times. Did you want to ask Ed something?
Actually, I did, but it kept on getting muted, so I didn't know who was doing that.
I was doing
my
it because we were
question-
getting feedback. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. So my question was like, okay, somewhere in the presentation, Dr. Glantz, you mentioned that, okay, risk mitigation, and you don't like the word mitigation.
Not
but
the
we
way
live in a
Go ahead.
But we live in a capitalist country. The moment we get the risk documented, we get liable for insurance, and then we are responsible for our shareholders, and then it gets into a cyclic mode. Okay, we know the risk, we did not fix the risk. That means our insurance goes up, and we don't get compensated for that. That's one way of looking at it. So don't you think like there is always a balance between like, okay, how much we should accept or recognize versus how much we should write it off?
Yes, but just to be clear, back to your original comment, the reason I didn't like the word mitigate was the way people were using it as a synonym for all of the risk treatments, and also the implication that we're willing to accept that the risk event is going to occur because we're not going to try to avoid it. So that's why I have a problem with the word mitigation. I have no problem with mitigation plans. There's a lot of risks that we cannot control the likelihood. Power outages for a hospital, for example. So we have to mitigate, we have to put plans in place to mitigate power outages in hospitals. So we have battery backup that will switch to propane or diesel generators in theory. Anyone know anything about Hurricane Katrina knows that didn't work in New Orleans because the generators were on the ground floor of the hospitals. They were the first things to go. But you're right, we have to strike a balance. And you're right, one of the problems with saying, can we at least start to identify risks, is that we create a liability, perhaps an insurance liability. So I think somehow this is going to have to be changed slowly in conjunction with all the parties, with the insurance organizations, so that we can start to identify risks with the understanding that some of them we're going to have to accept, and that we shouldn't see a spike in insurance as a result.
In my organization, there is one more thing. Actually, there is a lot of secrecy that we maintain about the security controls and those risk things, because one of the things, and when I was talking to somebody who was really higher up in the security, the first thing is like, what if that document gets into somebody's hands who's not supposed to get it? So the moment it gets in, we open our doors for everything. So what is the technique? What are the techniques for maintaining that risk document or our security controls document apart from everything else? So how do we protect the most protected resource, okay, differently than everything else we are protecting? I don't know how to explain.
You're right, because you're exactly right. If you go through and create a detailed list of all of your vulnerabilities, that document becomes a vulnerability just by having created it. But at the same time, I will not agree that not creating that document, not starting to prioritize, not starting to watch, not starting to treat, that's a better approach than what you're talking about is called security by obscurity. And we've been doing that for 30 years. I won't publish the phone number to my modem, so nobody will find it. So I don't agree that security by obscurity is a better alternative. I think an organization needs to have a discussion about, is security by obscurity better than trying to identify threats and vulnerabilities and then trying to keep that document offline so that someone can start to prioritize it and decide what to treat. Clearly right now, everyone seems to think that security by obscurity is okay. Let's ignore everything, put our head in the sand, and this is a better approach. But, then we have things like the Office of Personnel Management compromise. It's difficult. I think what your point is whatever you do, it's going to be difficult. I just don't think the path that we're on is sustainable. So I'm leaning more towards trying to deal with the alternative challenges that get created by having a very sensitive document.
Thank you, sir.
So, oops, it says I'm unmuted. Okay, hi. Where do you all think, and Ed included, EA plays a role in this landscape? Or do you not think it plays a role? Hello?
Yeah, I'll jump in while some other people are thinking, but I think at the very minimum, within the scope of the responsibility of the enterprise architect, it's something that has to be taken very seriously. And I would suggest that in that scope, in that space, that more rigorous risk analysis is begun.
Yeah, I think you got to look at your current views, and you don't have security. You're not encrypting data at rest, which in my mind is the number one important security measure, along with identity management, role-based access control, and a ton of other things associated with that. And preparing those for your future state and put that in your EA plan.
I just want to share another thought. I was at a presentation. It was one of the chief information officers from one of the large chip manufacturers, microprocessors, and he said, we did a risk analysis at our organization, so it must have been required strategic plan. Everyone had to go through the pain. It's a very painful process. He goes, they hated it. They were really glad when it was done. And I thought the most meaningful statement was when it was done. Because if you really think about it, that's whenever you have to start it all over again. And ideally, it should actually be woven into our daily responsibilities. They don't do quality at one point. It's part of every step of every day for anyone involved in manufacturing or purchasing. So I think that's where we should try to get to with all of this risk. Make it part of our jobs. And I think the enterprise architects certainly have an opportunity to start to set a precedent for the rest of the organization and start to demonstrate value.
Are you seeing some of those chat comments?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Michael just posted a really, really interesting and kind of a critical comment here. Something I didn't talk about at all. Talking about if you don't know what level of risk you're at. Implied in everything that I've been talking about is that the organization is aware and has communicated to its stakeholders what the acceptable risk appetite level is for that organization. So Dr. Walker at Penn State, do you have that document telling you what our risk exposure, our risk appetite should be for the activities that we pursue?
No. Do you?
Yeah, exactly. This is kind of baby steps, but it's implied, we should do the best job we can. And actually we have with ARL and our top secret research that's done at Penn State. And also with our student records, it's kind of implied that we have to be very conservative, have a very low risk appetite. But, it all starts right there. If the senior organization is not going to communicate down throughout the organization, this is what our risk portfolio or risk appetite should be, then how are any of us supposed to make intelligent decisions other than our best guess? And just to give you an example, an organization that would have a very large risk appetite would be most entrepreneurial organizations. They would have to be willing to accept a lot of risk to get their operations off the ground in most cases. But this is kind of implied in the background. What's the risk appetite for projects that we're pursuing? What's the risk tolerance? These are kind of exotic concepts to get to in this future world where risk becomes more embedded into our daily thinking. So a good comment.
Anyone else? I guess not. I guess not. Well, Ed, thanks so much. I know you've had a very long day. I know you didn't know that when you signed up for this. But
no, I didn't look at the calendar ahead of time. I'm glad everything worked out. I'd just like to thank everyone for participating. Your questions, your comments are excellent. I always enjoy working with our enterprise architecture students. They're so talented and gifted and motivated. It's a really an enjoyable group to be around.
They're good. Yeah, they're not so bad. So when do you go down to DC? When do you do that talk?
Tomorrow I drive to DC. It's actually Thursday and I think it's around 250 enterprise architects. It's a conference that's being hosted right in the middle of DC in the Reagan building, if anyone knows where that's at. So right in the very center of it.
And these are government affiliated?
Yeah, these are all people working for different branches of the government that are coming in. There are different roles of architecture, and the conference theme is security architecture. So I'm really pleased and excited. Anytime I've ever gone to any conference, I was just at the one in London, the Open Group. Anytime I'm around enterprise architects, they're the most passionate and excited and enthusiastic conferences to go to. I just love being around them, and that's one thing this class all has in common is that shared motivation.
Yeah. Well, and you'll be back Friday for our meeting or not?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. It's according to plan.
That's
according to plan. Yeah.
Yeah, according to plan. Okay, great. Just a little side stuff, you guys. And
like we don't see each other.
Ed is key to our as we plan for this enterprise risk management and EA symposium. So yeah, Ed, take care. Is Ed a security risk? Only if he doesn't come back. Yeah, that he's a real risk. All right.
Becomes my threat.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Ed, we'll let you go here.
Okay. Thanks, you, everybody.
Thanks so much. So everyone else, I could go through some of those discussion themes, but I think what I'll do is just post them because I think we've pretty much covered them. If that's all right with you, and we could end 18 minutes early tonight. What do you think? End early, please. Oh, yes, right. Oh, I'm hurt, you guys. I'm hurt. Okay, great. So that's what we'll do. That is what we'll do. So the discussion board was great. And I appreciate, as always, I appreciate you spending time with me. And Ed really does enjoy. I guess the security people aren't as interesting as you guys are, because I asked Ed to do this last semester and he said, yeah, okay. And then he just raved about the quality of the students. So when I asked him to come back this semester, he was like, absolutely. Yes, secretive bunch. Right. So I think Ed was pleased again, which I'm always happy to make Ed happy because he's a real asset to the EA Center. So without further ado, y'all, well, that's okay. You're exceptional, Eric. You're exceptional. Without further ado, you all have a good week, and see you next Tuesday. Good night.
Good night.
You are currently the only person in this conference.